Welcome everyone to the Roaring Twenties, the time of Prohibition in the extraordinary life of Edith Weeks, or Madame Bobe. Edith Weeks came to New York from Detroit in 1912. She got her first job as a cutter in a cloak and suit industry. She was a hard-working girl and was talented in designing. It was not long before she had opened a very unpretentious little millinery shop far up on Broadway, where rents were cheap and she could operate on a slim margin. Business was good, and presently she moved to a better neighborhood, named herself Madame Bobe, and began to thrive. Her new establishment was 4 stories. The 3rd story was her lavish bedroom, and the 4th story was her workroom, employing 16 beautiful girls. Her social talents were very marked, and she found it easy to form friendships with moving picture actresses who brought her gradually in touch with movie stars, who autographed her photographs and otherwise allowed her to trade on their prestige. The custom of a movie star is as valuable to a milliner as a visit of the Prince of Wales would be to a haberdasher, and Edith Weeks, as Madame Bobe, was now on her feet for a long period of prosperity. Bobe was not satisfied with business supremacy. Some of the movie stars, attracted by her personality, had taken her to a few after-midnight parties, and a bit of it got into her blood. With her genius for making friends, she widened her circle as rapidly as she increased her business. As the number of her friends grew, she was able to introduce them to each other, to their mutual advantage and to her own. For instance, if a manager needed the services of an actress, and the actress was equally anxious to get an engagement, she could make an arrangement that pleased them both, and also establish a strong connection on her own hook. In this way, without particular references to her business, she quickly became one of the best-known women on Broadway and one of the most influential in the nightlife circle of the metropolis. Who was this Madame Bobe who confessed to being 23 but looked rather older? And why should a fashionable New York milliner maintain a bar room in her basement and a well-stocked wine cellar? Her ambitions were not to become a famous milliner so much as they were to become a personality, someone to be stared at and pointed out at first-night performances, the intimate friend of celebrities and the companion of theatrical starts and spectacular people who crowd into the limelight of New York City. So Bobe's establishment became a rendezvous for the interesting people she wanted to know. The location and furnishings of the place were of such a character that no one would suspect that it was a millinery shop at all. It was discreetly removed from the vulgar business section and plopped right in the middle of fashionable East 63rd Street, in the midst of New York City's most exclusive residences. And there was nothing about the house that would distinguish it from the homes of the socially prominent next door. Madame Bobe was not so crude as to hang out a millinery sign, or to install a shop window in the front of the building, or even to advertise at all. When a milliner charges $100 or $150 for a hat, she has to reverse the usual process of salesmanship and make her customers come to her. And the only way Madame Bobe helped her clients out was to put her name in the telephone book and affix a small bronze plate to the doorbell, reading simply, Madame Bobe. Madame's acquaintances ran into all walks of life and brought all sorts of unusual things. When Count Salm von Hoogstraten arrived in the U.S., he was penniless, but he had champagne tastes. He was admittedly looking for an American heiress, so it was only natural that he would end up in Madame Bobe's choice little circle of friends. The threadbare Count wandered from prospect to prospect, sizing them up. He was engaged to one woman when he noticed Miss Millicent Rogers. She was young, beautiful, and the daughter of a man worth $40 million. The Count canceled his engagement to the other woman and eloped with Millicent. The marriage wasn't to succeed, for soon her father, Mr. Rogers, disappointed the Count financially, and Millicent ran home to her parents. Madame Bobe denied that she made the unfortunate match, but she added that the Count was the greatest lover in the world. Madame Bobe was probably one of the best-dressed women in New York, and the most careful of her personal appearance. Every day she had a 3-hour session with a masseuse. To this is added her hours of exercise, which include every form of calisthenics calculated to keep the figure within its perfect dimensions. The best hairdresser in New York calls once a day to gild her hair with a French preparation containing a gold solution. Her diet is prescribed by one of New York's best-known specialists. To these advantages, Madame Bobe adds a natural-born talent for dressing well. She is known about Broadway as the Ostrich Feather Girl because of her extraordinary collection of magnificent plumes. She has dresses of almost every pastel shade that are trimmed with huge ostrich plumes of the same color, with boas to match. Her stockings are of the finest silk stitched with the most elaborate embroidery, and never cost less than $60 a pair. She has several negligées that cost $1,000 apiece. Her lingerie has many articles that cost from $400 to $500 apiece. With all the advantages of clothes and beauty doctors at her command, Madame is a keen student of men and has more admirers than many younger and more beautiful women. On a Saturday night in September 1924, Madame Bobe had been the honored guest of a birthday party given at her home. It had been a notable event and had endured merrily far beyond the witching hour. Each of the guests, it is said, presented Madame with a $20 gold piece as a souvenir of the occasion, and these were hidden in various nooks and crannies, vases and crevices about the house. Also, her lover, Robert L. Haig, the widely known Standard Oil official, presented her with a $10,000 bracelet. This bracelet was set with 432 round diamonds and 100 lesser stones. The party was wild and went on until 8:30 the next morning. 2 days later, on Monday night, she and Haig went to the theater. She was wearing her $10,000 diamond bracelet, one platinum chain set with 99 diamonds, one bracelet with several parallel rows of diamonds and sapphires, a diamond wrist watch, and a pearl and jade bracelet. Besides these trifles, she also wore 2 strings of heavy pearls, a 15-carat emerald ring, and any one of her 25 pairs of earrings. Quite a remarkable collection of jewels that anyone would covet. While Bobe and Haig were out, a man posing as a delivery man from the drugstore appeared at the barred grill entrance of Madame Bobe's home with a package. The maid let him in after some hesitancy. The package proved to contain a blackjack, but the maid did not know that. She went to sleep. The man had accomplices and let them in. They ransacked the unusual boudoir, bar, and workshop, and sat down to an orgy of wine and cigars to await her return. Madame and Haig returned about 11:30. A muscular man standing in the shadows of the hallway made a swipe with a blackjack, which was meant to crash on Bobe's bobbed curls. His aim was bad, and the weapon cut a gash in one of her cheeks and knocked out 3 teeth. Another blow knocked Haig down. Madame Bobe fought like a tigress. She was hurled against one of the $10,000 lamps, which crashed to ruin. A thug took her by the throat and beat her head against a priceless vase. One bandit was standing over Mr. Haig when his mask fell from his face. The bandit aimed his gun at Mr. Haig and hissed, "Well, take a good look at me. I'm going to kill you." Madame Bobe pleaded with him on her knees not to shoot. She screamed for the thief not to harm him, and she told him she would give him anything in the house. This appeal probably saved Mr. Haig's life, for the bandit readjusted his mask, and he and his cronies went about their work of looting. The men tore the new bracelet worth $10,000 from her arm and took an 8-carat diamond ring valued at $7,500, a string of pearls and diamonds valued at $10,000, and an ermine wrap trimmed with fox skins worth $5,000. They finally left, taking Haig's watch, cigarette case, and roll of bills. When the police received a call from one of Madame Bobe's maids, who told them that her mistress had been beaten and choked and robbed of $100,000 worth of jewels, they rushed over to the millinery establishment, fully expecting to find a private residence, and stepped right into an old-fashioned pre-Prohibition barroom. Inside the fancy grating and behind the ornate cobalt blue windows was a long room, decorated in the manner of an old-time waterfront saloon. A long mahogany bar, equipped with a brass rail, stood at one end of the room, and back of it was a mirror. Very strange equipment for a millinery shop. Behind the bar stood scores of bottles containing all the wines and whiskeys that had been banished by Prohibition. That was a startling spectacle for a squad of New York City policemen to encounter. There was real sawdust on the floor and cheap lithographs and supposed art calendars on the wall that were instantly reminiscent of the old days. Heavy brass cuspidors stood in the corners. All the entrances to the room were equipped with swinging doors, and there were booths in the wall containing the familiar rickety tables covered by checkered tablecloths. In building this barroom into this house in fashionable East 63rd Street, why had Madame chosen to model it on the cheap saloons of the old Bowery and sailors' resorts? The police wondered. For a moment, the police, accustomed to strange sights, thought they were having hallucinations. They went back to the reception hall through which they had entered. That room was decorated with valuable paintings, mirrors, and brocades, delicate Louis XV chairs, covered with tapestry and gold leaf. They stood demurely about the walls. A stairway leading to the upstairs rooms was padded with fancy carpet that cost the price of many, many $150 hats. Undoubtedly, they were in the home of some very wealthy person, the police decided, and yet there was that waterfront bar in the next room. Madame explained the robbery to the policemen after they had climbed through luxuriously furnished rooms to her boudoir on the 3rd floor. She told them the whole story. The police listened sympathetically, and there was still that barroom to be explained, and they thought that the explanation of it might shed some light on the robbery. What on earth, they asked Madame, was a barroom doing in a millinery establishment? Madame Bobe, already afflicted by the loss of several teeth, not to mention her $100,000 in jewels, became quite indignant. She explained that she had many friends and that it amused her and amused her friends to have a real barroom on the premises where parties could be held without much damage to the furniture. The police were interested beyond the scope of Madame Bobe's robbery. It was possible that the same men who robbed Bobe were connected with the mysterious murders of Dorothy King and Louise Lawson, Broadway butterflies who were recently strangled for their jewels. They surmised that since her parties were rather large, that there was a chance that one or two of the bandits had been guests of hers. It was known that many of New York's expert criminals insinuate themselves into gatherings without an invitation, checking out the guests and their jewels. Every Saturday night, and sometimes during the week, 40, 50, 60, or even 90 of Madame Bobe's dear friends called at her house and crowned the Milliner of New York's exclusive East Side the Queen of Broadway. Each Saturday night was like a Mardi Gras. The guests comprised of some of the best-known names of the moving pictures and theatrical world, and not a few were social celebrities. Chiefly the very young, however. The barroom was vulgar, but the rest of the four-story house was decorated lavishly with heavy oriental carpets heaped with pillows of lace and brocade, walls hung with valuable oil paintings, dim lights, and rare statuary, all in the Louis XV mode. For those guests who wanted a bit more privacy, the back garden had little pavilions containing comfortable swings and upholstered settees. Some of these little tents were just big enough for two. They were charmingly surrounded with scented shrubbery, and the light coming from the windows of the house was dim and discreet. The little tent parties were perhaps the most popular feature of Madame's weekly carnival. Of course, Madame's next-door neighbors didn't care for the parties. Most of her neighbors moved in a society in which the customary conventions of life were rigorously regarded. Some of them had children whose sleep was disturbed, and few overheard things that they considered to be outside the bounds of propriety. It seems the events at Madame's house were similar to orgies at times, and the neighbors had to endure the noise. Complaining did no good. The guests would tell them to basically mind their own business, and unfortunately, many of the talented guests insisted on performing at 4 o'clock in the morning. That angered the neighbors even more. Some of the entertainment could be a ballad sung, followed by a storming applause and the sound of bottles banging on the bar, or a clog dance, or any variety of endless performances going on once a week. When Madame Bobe was robbed, she surrendered to the thieves the diamond bracelet, an 8-carat diamond ring valued at $7,500, a string of pearls and diamonds valued at $10,000, and an ermine wrap trimmed with fox skins worth $5,000. From Mr. Haig, the bandits obtained a gold watch and about $200 in cash. Stripped of her jewels, 3 of her teeth knocked out, a scar on her face, and the cute little barroom now dismantled and closed, Madame was not at the end of her troubles. The U.S. Prohibition officials at once sat up and took notice of the newspaper reports of the barroom and those all-night parties. Madame moved into the 63rd Street house less than 2 years earlier. She therefore could not have had that generous stock of wines and liquors on the premises before the Volstead law went into effect 5 years before. But if Madame had a fine stock of lawfully acquired liquors before the Prohibition law, she might have moved the liquors from her old home to the 63rd Street address by submitting a full list of all the liquors and obtaining a permit to transfer them from her old residence to the little barroom. If a search of the records of personal permits to transfer liquors does not reveal any permit granted the milliner to move liquors to her present millinery shop, then Madame was in very serious trouble. She seemed to come out of the robbery smoothly. The current Mrs. Robert Haig obtained a divorce because of all the publicity that raged of the robbery, and, of course, her husband's involvement with Bobe. A year later, Bobe was having a friendship with Lee Armstrong, a successful vaudeville actor, and rumors were spreading about her and Haig getting married. She did eventually marry Haig, and from then on, She was called Mrs. Edith Haig, no more Bobe. The couple were divorced in 1927, although they denied the divorce for at least 3 years. Haig seems to be quite a ladies' man. In 1931, it was announced that he had been secretly married to an operatic prima donna named Mary Lewis, who was from Hot Springs, Arkansas. In 1933, Edith Bobe Haig was still a member of society and doing very well. In July 1934, she was still going by the name of Edith Haig. Poor Edith was with her companion, Frank L. Pratt, a jeweler. They returned to her apartment at 3:50 in the morning on July 25th, after being at a club. An intruder had evidently gained entrance to Mrs. Haig's apartment by a pass key. Believing the couple were not due home until late in the morning, he had made himself comfortable while he waited. When Edith and Frank got back to her apartment, they opened the apartment door. A masked man with a pistol stepped in front of them. The bandit quietly trussed up his 2 victims and snatched from Mrs. Haig 2 diamond bracelets, a diamond necklace, and a large square-cut diamond ring. Before leaving the apartment, the thug dumped his victims into a clothes closet. Pratt managed to free himself, untie Mrs. Haig, and call the police. An epidemic of jewel robberies of this type occurred in the exclusive Sutton Place a year ago, with the thugs obtaining a total of $1,250,000 in loot from society women. Among the most famous victims in that section were Mrs. Harold Glenby, wife of the perfume manufacturer, and Gertrude Williams. So Edith is still running in high society circles. In 1935, Bobe filed for bankruptcy. She listed her assets at $3,574 and her liabilities at $16,161. She received a bankruptcy discharge, so many of her debts were erased. In 1940, Robert Haig died of cirrhosis of the liver. He was a very famous person, much more so than Madame Bobe. His famous last words to all his women were, "I'll remember you in my will." Girls he cared for, girls he loved, girls he married, and he married 4. They all believed him. He possessed millions, and he spent like a sailor on shore leave. He staked actors at liberty, backed shows for actresses, poured champagne at parties, and was the most jovial member of more than 10 clubs. The girls who expected to inherit money from Haig apparently took the matter very seriously. Haig remembered several of them in his last will and testament, in which attorneys estimated he distributed more than $5 million. But when his estate was appraised, the debts were found to overwhelm the assets. 3 of the girls found themselves heavy losers of their own funds. When he died at age 60, his wife at the time was Mary Lewis, the opera singer. But they had been legally separated for 3 years. Mary had gone to Norway to perfect herself in her profession, and Haig had made liberal provisions for her in the separation agreement. He promised her he would remember her in his will, so he bequeathed her a life interest in 1/2 of his estate. So when the official accounting was filed in July 1940, his assets of $433,662 were utterly submerged by $718,129 in debt, with claims still coming in. Mary Lewis filed a claim of her own for $22,000, which she said represented the value of a block of stock which her spouse had given her. She had no claim because she had never transferred the shares to herself. On top of all the claims against the estate, Uncle Sam claimed that Bob owed $500,000 in taxes for the 3 years before his death. Even more startling was that one of Bob's earlier wives, Mrs. Stella Ritchie Haig, to whom he paid $500 a month in alimony, said he promised to remember her in his will with $50,000 if she did not marry. This strikes me as very funny. His fiancée at the time of his death was Christine Fisher. She sued the estate for the $50,000 four-story house at 127 East 80th Street. This house she thought she was entitled to. Well, she got nothing. And of course, wife number 3, Edith Bobe, got nothing. One fun fact was that Christine Fisher, Haig's fiancée at his death, was investigated. Checks were introduced to show that Bob had given Christine $67,000 in the 18 months before his death. Private detectives testified that more than $16,000 was found in Christine's apartment, tucked under rugs, in flower pots, and in mattresses. After that came the deluge of debts on the head of the actress. Christine was charged with bills from interior decorators, a marble and tile company, plumbers, a cabinet company, and Nicole de Paris, a gown shop, and an oriental art dealer. A swank furrier filed a claim against the estate, listing furs bought by Christine: a sable coat for $5,000, mink coat $5,000, silver fox coat $2,500, Russian ermine coat $1,600, and against that total of $14,100, $3,565 was still unpaid. The only person who came out on the plus side was his 90-year-old mother. She had flown out from Arizona to see him on his deathbed, and she had his heavy life insurance policy signed over to her. In a 1940 census, Edith Bobe Haig lived at 65 West 55th Street. She was 49. Her occupation was executive, and the industry is millinery and dresses. During her life, Bobe partied a lot and traveled extensively. I found her in ship's manifests for England, the Bahamas, to France several times, one to Bermuda, just to name a few places. It was very difficult to find information about Edith's early years, but I did find that she had been married to a William Whites, who died. She went by the name of Edith Bobe Whites on her passport. Very interesting woman, for sure. I also found out that her father was a policeman in Detroit, and that she left home at 16 to make her way in the big city. And she certainly did that. The last I found, that I'm positive is our Edith, is a death listing. She died on 25 September 1961 at the age of 70. I enjoyed telling the story of Madame Bobe's quirky life and just a bit of Robert Haig's life. I hope you enjoyed her story as much as I enjoyed telling it. Subscribe for more stories. Thanks for listening. Bye.